Hello, everyone, and thank you again. It's an honor to be here at this gathering. I've already learned so much from my time here in Berlin, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and to returning home to digest what I've learned here and to thinking about ways in which we can cooperate. Today, I'd like to share a bit about my work and talk about the work that I've been doing and the insights and experience I've gained from working for the past 15 years with social and political movements that are struggling for human rights and democratic development all over the world. I've been doing this work for 15 years, as I said, at the Albert Einstein Institution, which is an organization that was founded 35 years ago by the scholar Gene Sharp. Gene began his work in the 1950s, and in many ways, the political climate of the time very much mirrors the situation that we find ourselves in the United States and also around the world. He, at 25 years old, was looking out at a pretty dark world with the rise of dictatorship and authoritarianism, the use of atomic weapons and the increased militarism around the world, racial and economic inequality. It was also the time of McCarthyism, where intellectual freedoms and civil liberties were under great threat, and scholars and students and teachers and ordinary citizens were being arrested because they were seen as a threat to the US's fight against communism. And for a young person who was looking out at the world and concerned with the world, and also really thinking about what their role was and trying to fight these very serious political conditions, he learned about Gandhi and the Indian independence movement. And that had a really big impact on him. And it wasn't just in terms of inspiring him. He really saw it as an opportunity for learning, for collecting insight. So he started researching what happened in India and the 1930s and the 1940s. And his approach, which I'm going to speak about in a bit, was a little different than the normal thinking of the time. Because then, in the 1950s, as is the case today, we tend to make symbols of our nonviolent heroes, our historical heroes, and especially in the way that we're teaching about them. We often strip them of the substance of their complex selves, which tell us about who they were and also what allowed them to do the things they did, which means we lose the opportunity to really learn from them. And this struck me very quickly in the difference between that approach and the one that Gene Sharp has adopted when I started working at the institution in 2002. There's an incredible example that took place in the region where I was born, in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it was something that I had learned about, but in a very different way. And this was the case of Bacha Khan. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this person. His full name was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And he led a movement during the 1920s and 30s in this, what was at that time called the Northwest Frontier Province of British India. So the people of the region, just as they did want to in the rest of India, wanted to expel the British. And they used, normal means to do that, mostly violent attacks. So tribes would come down from the mountains, they would attack a British garrison. The British would respond by destroying all the crops of a village as collective punishment. And then the process would continue to repeat itself. But in the 1920s, this man named Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan emerged, and he began a social reform movement. And it was based on a simple but really profound idea. And what Khan said was that the domination and oppression of his people was only possible because they were themselves weak. So he said that the first step, instead of attacking the British head-on, was to strengthen themselves and to develop the capacity and to get power. And only then could they use that power to fight the British. He said that asking weak people to take effective action was like asking a paralyzed hand to lift a spoon. I was supposed to show you Khan. There he is with Gandhi. So here's what they did. They created schools all over the province, and they were teaching science. They were teaching really practical subjects like hygiene, how to clean your home, how to prevent the spread of disease, the importance of volunteerism, service in society. And they taught the arts, poetry and music. They included women and children, older people. Obviously, the violent struggle they had been using was really done by very few people, and that's able-bodied young men. This movement really incorporated just a really wide demographic of society. They also had a structure and a hierarchy, and if you look it up, you'll see a lot of pictures of them in uniforms. They really modeled themselves after an army, but a nonviolent one. So the movement grew to 100,000 people in 1938. And let's remember what we're talking about here. This is a very rural environment. It had very little network between villages. It's in the mountains, and it's also before Facebook. So if you imagine the level of organizing and the messaging and the work that it took to organize 100,000 people, you can really think about really the amazing nature of this movement. So incredibly powerful movement. Gandhi even said at the time that we must learn from the bravery and the discipline and organization of the Pashtuns. And you know the Pashtuns have been in the news more recently for very different reasons. What happened was incredibly important. It was incredible for the region. It's incredible for the world. So incredibly important to distill the lessons we can learn. And it has enormous lessons for the world. But guess what? I never learned about it. And I never learned about it in Pakistan, where I lived. And I never learned about it in the United States, where I went to school. Instead, I learned about the history of war and violence, and how it had liberated both of those countries, Afghanistan from the Soviets and the United States from the British. Nonviolent struggle has a long and rich history, but it's hugely neglected in favor of highlighting a history of war and violence. It's neglected in our schools, it's neglected in our churches and in our families, in our national mythologies, and in other places of learning. But this is dangerous because how can we teach future generations? If we teach future generations that history is determined by the decisions of leaders and the progress that was won by war and violence, then what message are we giving them? It is that our own choices when we're facing political problems are also to either use violence or to do nothing and trust in the system. How can we know what's possible for the future if we don't know what's been made possible by brave and courageous people throughout history? This neglect of this history had a big impact on me because I really grew up glorifying war and violence, as so many people do. I was a young refugee of the Soviet war. So I really learned that war had violence, resistance violence, had liberated Afghans, had defended their communities, had defended their families. So what else are people going to do if they can't use this most powerful means available to us all? I was raised that violence was the most powerful tool that we have available in our fight for freedom. And for me, I found this work. And I realized that that powerful means of defending yourself, of defending your community, of defending your country and your values and your religion and culture and all of that, it was not violence. It was something else just as powerful, if not more powerful. But it was completely neglected in our society. That teaches us that, again, war and violence are the drivers of social change and the historical events that have shaped our world. And so it was really an incredibly powerful moment for me when I found the work that I do now to find out that you can be tough, like really tough, and be nonviolent. And you can be really effective and pragmatic and strategic and be nonviolent. So At the Einstein Institution, we look at these cases that have happened throughout history, and there are thousands of them. And we ask questions like, what did people actually do? Why did they make the choice to use nonviolent resistance rather than using violence or doing nothing? How did they do it? What did their leadership look like? Was there a structure in place to make decisions? How do they develop strategy? Were there any use of strategic planning or tactical planning? How do they escalate their activities? How do they prepare for repression? How do they prevent their movements from falling apart in face of repression? I'll go back. How do they communicate their messages? You know, how they communicated their message was very different in the 1920s and the 1820s than it's going to be now, of course. How do they bring outsiders into their movements? How do they deal with third-party support? What worked well and what contributed to failure? And that's an important question because we think you can learn a lot from failures just as you can from successes. So basically, we think about what can we learn? What can we learn from these movements? And what we have done is to create a system of what people have been doing for thousands of years by trial and error. For the people that I work with, this idea is really empowering, that there's a system to conducting struggle and that it can be learned, and so that it can be applied with greater effectiveness than the movements of the past. And that therefore we can have better outcomes than the movements of the past. The historical cases that we've studied, people have been incredibly brave, but most of the time they didn't really know what they were doing. They had very little knowledge of how nonviolent resistance works. They often were turning to bits and pieces of their own history, of the history of other movements that they had heard about, and not much understanding of the dynamics of nonviolent resistance. Some of them were using a little bit of tactical planning, so how to do an action today or for the next week, but they hardly ever had strategic planning, which we define as the overall plan to use the resources you have to get the resources that you need in order to achieve very specific objectives. So this is the research we've been doing. I want to show you a quick quote here from a person named Iyad al-Baghdadi. He's a Palestinian that was living in the United Arab Emirates until the Arab uprisings, where he was eventually deported because although he was a tech guy, computer guy, he ended up becoming an important voice during the Arab Spring, and he was deported for it. So he's currently living in Norway, and he says this quote, which unfortunately has cut off at the end. There is a word missing. I'll tell you what that word is. He adapts this quote from something that Martin Luther King said, which is that those who want peace must organize as effectively as those who want war. And he says, those who want liberty must organize as effectively as those who want tyranny. So the idea that we're increasingly facing opponents that are very well equipped, well resourced, that understand the need for strategy, and we must also organize as well, if not better, use all the creativity and energy that exists in our societies in order to be more effective and not do it as you go along and make it up as you go along and operate based on intuition. So I talked a little bit about the research that we've been doing, looking at these historical cases and distilling the lessons, and then sharing the results of that research. This is just to illustrate the way in which the work has been disseminated. This is smuggling editions of the book. So this knowledge is considered so threatening that people are serving jail sentences and being arrested for carrying copies of this book. So people in their, the way in which they're so incredibly creative and innovative have figured out how to disguise these books. So they have this fake cover, if you read Spanish, that says a wolf among sheep. Or is it the other way around? No. Does anyone speak Spanish? A wolf among sheep. So inside is a book called From Dictatorship to Democracy, which has a very interesting history, which I would love to share with you. Our time is limited, and all of this information, much of it is available for download from our book. That book was written for Burmese dissidents, but who asked Gene to write about, something that they could apply very sort of practically, because a lot of this is sort of general theory. And he said, but I don't know Burma, so I can't really tell you what to do. Either way, that's not very empowering for me to give you advice as an outsider. But what I can do, and what I do know, is dictatorship. I know how oppressive systems operate, and I know how, the conditions that make that possible and the conditions of oppressed people. So I can write a general analysis, and that's what he did. And then that book went on to be spread around the world, and we also have it in German. So this is I think this is the audio version of the book. Yes. So you may be wondering how we kind of do our work. We conduct this research. How has it sort of taken a life of its own? It's spread around the world in terms of its publications. People figure out when they want to make social and political change, they look for information that can help them. They usually go first to Gandhi, Dr. King, some of the other big cases that we know, and very quickly they find the work of our work. Gene Sharp's work, and that has kind of distilled all of this history. And we also share the research through consultations and workshops. So these are sort of educational efforts that we've developed on how we can kind of supplement the written material. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to transfer this knowledge. I've been witnessing the work in a very interesting decade for it, as it's become much better known, as the use of it has spread, as governments have learned about it and have set up their research institutions to try to fight this work and to try to stop movements from using it. And so it's a very, very critical time for this work. And so I'm working now. I'll tell you a little bit about, sort of traditionally how the work was done. I talked about that. And then the workshops, the way that they were conducted, where groups would contact us and say, can we have 2 days or 5 days in which we can learn a bit more about this work. So it was mainly lecture style. So we had the US-based experts stand and talk to a room full of people on the theory. And we're starting to learn that doesn't work very well. It takes such an intellectual leap, to kind of apply that theory that has, very wide application to a particular situation. So we're in this point now where we're looking for how we can innovate this work. It's already had this massive impact in spite of the fact that it's really quite academic. It's written in a way that's easy to understand. It's written in a way so you don't have to have 2 PhDs to understand it. And I think that's really facilitated its spread in countries where people don't speak English, it's assisted in translations and things like that. So at this point, we're looking out really at how we can improve the system we've developed and how do we better collect that knowledge using technology, using innovation, and better share that knowledge with people, who need it, when they need it, so they're not having to constantly reinvent the wheel. And unfortunately, I haven't figured that out. But that is what I'm working on. I'm currently at the MIT Media Lab, which is a great center for innovation and technology and innovation and education. And so I'm meeting with people from, for once, outside of my field and really bringing in new disciplines. Because I think that's really where the strength of this work lies, in kind of harnessing the collective energy of multiple groups that may not all believe the same thing, but that can work together for a common goal. I know my time is limited, and I also, they're telling me I can continue, but I just finished telling you we don't learn by being lectured. I think that, one thing that we do, which I have found that whether I'm working with like very young people or, everything in between, that we learn by like experience and by touching things and by, looking, like hearing about stories. The power of stories is so important. I'm learning more and more about that. I'm trying to incorporate more of that, also more of my personal story in my presentations. And back to physical objects. I have 2 things very quickly that I just want to share with you, which excite me very much. And that is, first, about not celebrating our nonviolent heroes. I think this is a real problem. We have museums everywhere dedicated to the history of war and violence, and we take our students and like show them, you know, the horrors of war, and that's all very, very important, and the glories of war also. But I learned recently that the government of Lithuania had, for the first time, to my knowledge, had produced a medal. A medal like the way they give to heroes of war, had produced it for people who had actually participated in a nonviolent struggle, in which in 1991, they had citizens, ordinary citizens, had poured out into the streets and barricaded, formed a human barricade around their government buildings during Soviet occupation. And so this was really to recognize the value of these thousands of citizens who had done this. So I went on eBay. I didn't actually receive this medal, and I bought this medal. But I bought it so I can show it to you. So I just wanted to show you, and maybe we can, if we like, pass this around.
Sure, let me. Thanks.
And the second object, maybe related, maybe not related, but I always love telling this story, which is that about 1 year ago, I was going through some boxes that had not been opened since the 1950s, right? I'm searching in Gene Sharp's basement. And I found, you know, I wonder what I'm going to find in here. And there it was, 13 letters, original letters with their signatures of correspondence between Gene Sharp and Albert Einstein. And this was a correspondence that he had done in the 1950s when he was reaching out for someone who could like write an introduction to his first book on Gandhi. And I read these letters, and some of them have never been published before. Some of them exist in the Einstein archives, but some of them don't. So it's information that is enormously insightful, so inspirational. And basically what Einstein tells the 25-year-old Gene Sharp is that civil disobedience and the Gandhian method was the best hope for humanity in facing massive political problems of that time and future crises. And that was hugely important for Gene Sharp in terms of giving him the affirmation he needed at such a critical time to do his work. So I, have huge admiration and love for Gene Sharp, but I also think that these words at such a critical moment at the end of Einstein's life, for such a thoughtful, genius, and well-respected person of our time is something we can all learn from. So I don't have the original, sorry, but I do have some copies of the letter here, and these have not been viewed before, so you can pass them around and have a look. And at this point, I'll just sort of stop there, and I just want to say I really appreciate this opportunity. Again, I see it really as a learning experience. I think there's so much we can all learn from each other and learn from bravery and wisdom of so many people doing such amazing work all over the world. And so I really look forward to that process, and would love to hear from you about your thoughts on how I can strengthen my work and how we can, collectively strengthen all of our work. So thank you so much. Thank you.